Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Mourning Coffee Podcast. I am your host, Brooke Carlock, and I am so excited for today's guest. I've been hoping to have her on the show for a really long time, so I'm super honored that she has decided to be here with us today. So I am going to be speaking with Meghan Riordan Jarvis. She is kind of a powerhouse in the grief world. I feel like she's done everything. She is a clinically trained trauma therapist. She's worked in the world of grief for so long. She is an author of two of the best books I've ever read about grief. She's a podcast host, a two-time TEDx speaker. The list goes on. I could, be here all day talking about all of the amazing things that she does in the grief world. So I cannot wait to chat with her today. So without further ado, we're going to bring Meghan on stage. Hi, Meghan. Thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here.
No, I really appreciate it. Okay, first, I always start off asking what everyone is drinking. Are you drinking anything today?
Do you know what? I deliberately had my my iced coffee. So I have
Nice.
in here. I don't have this much. I'm not drinking this much iced coffee, but I've got my iced coffee.
That would be a lot of caffeine. Yeah. So what flavor? Just regular?
I am a traditional, like it needs to taste like coffee, but I add enough cream that it's more like coffee ice cream.
Coffee. So, yeah, that's kind of how mine is too. So cool. Very nice. Thank you for sharing. So I always kind of like to start by asking how you got into the grief world or what happened to you. But I think your story is interesting because you were actually working in the grief field before you really experienced your own grief, right?
I mean, I was to some degree. I grew up with the story of having a young man who was beloved by my family. He died. He drowned when I was 9. And it was just a background story in my life as far as I understood it. But as I grew up and went into therapy and sort of learned about how unresolved death, like no conversation about grief and loss, can leave a tattoo or an imprint. So I had this experience that if you had asked me anytime before I started therapy at 23, I would have said like, no, that wasn't such a big deal. But I came to understand that there's a way in which events like that, traumas like that, sort of shift the trajectory of how you then go on to live. So for example, at 9 years old, I was like, oh, parents don't keep kids safe, kids can die. Which is not we're all reading like Charlotte's Web and stuff, but that's about a spider dying, not about, your sailing instructor. So I didn't have, so that was sort of like the background. And I went into a helping profession. I became a social worker, which I don't think was a surprise to anyone. I'm a middle child of 6 kids. And I loved, I really went into therapy because I was having a really hard time getting over a breakup. I fell in love with therapy, which for me really was, you don't have to inherit all of other people's ideas about what your life has to look like. So I was in therapy for a while. When I came out the other side, I started doing what you really have to do to become a good therapist, which is like take all the clinical trainings that are outside of your schooling. And those were more trauma related. So I wanted to be able to help people who had trauma in their systems. And the thing about trauma is the underlying conversation of trauma is what was lost every time. And in order to be able to live with what was lost, you have to grieve what was lost. So even before, I think I would have told you I identified as a trauma therapist in my early years. I now understand that every conversation that I've ever had in therapy is really an assessment and an intervention around, what was lost and how do we grieve it? What are our skill sets to grieve?
Yeah. So I had one, I'm smack in the middle of 5.
Oh my God.
So I get where you're coming from.
Exactly. Yes. I don't need to
I understand. I became a teacher, so I get it.
I trained as a teacher first. I have a master's degree in early childhood education.
All right. So that tracks.
Yep.
And what you said about, being a 9-year-old and realizing that, I immediately thought of my daughter's classmates. She was 10 in 5th grade and they had to deal with that. And I think so many times we forget how much of an impact that can be on, the younger people when something like that happens. So yeah, that just struck me as a connection there. Really, I just was like,
Yeah.
oh man, yeah, her friends are going through that exact thing. And
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah,
that's so hard.
absolutely. Yeah, and often I think so, my middle son, when he was 7 turning 8, a child in his class who he was friends with,
Mhm.
died of a rare form of cancer sort of suddenly, and I it made me panic. It just triggered all this old stuff for me, and, so as a social worker, I was like, what are you doing? How are you supporting? And I went in and, it's like a new school social worker. And she said, well, I went in and I looked and all the kids seem fine. So we're just going to move forward. And I was like, ah, and I mean, I think with an edge, I was like, if you're waiting for my child to act out, if you're waiting for him to indicate that he needs some kind of support, that's not going to happen. That's
Yeah,
not who this kid is.
yeah,
So let's bring the curriculum about loss into the classroom and not rely on his behavior or his ability to talk about something that he cannot talk about.
yeah,
And I have to say, like the school, I feel like unlike 1986 when I experienced a loss, and I'm sure for your daughter's, classmates, there's a lot more. There are a lot more books, and there's a lot more understanding that like we don't just not talk about hard things to kids. Like they
yeah,
live in the world.
yes.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, they're feeling it too. I
Yes.
agree. So
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about, because in reading your books and learning about you, I know that you were in, the therapy field, but
Yes.
then it was really when you lost your parents that you kind of really felt that
Yes.
PTSD for the first time and how the trauma can affect, your grief process. So I was just wondering if you could walk us through that a little bit.
Yeah. So I'll answer this two different ways. One is it's really humbling when you're helping people with something, right? Where you're like, oh, I'm going to help you apply for college if
Mhm.
you haven't applied for college. And then when
Right.
you're applying for college yourself, you're like, shit, these questions are really
Yeah.
hard.
Yeah.
So it's not that I didn't have loss. I also had a beloved friend when I was in my 20s die suddenly. I mean, it's not, but I didn't have the kind of profound, earth shattering changes all the compass points
Yeah.
in your until my mom died. And so my dad died first of cancer, but he had a diagnosis that was so serious that when he got it, I understood and he understood that he was dying.
Right.
And so the way that I talk about that is like, oh, I participated in his death. It was
Mhm.
hard, but it was kind of titrated. Every time I saw him, he looked less well. So from
Yeah.
that like learning perspective and the sort of walking towards the pain, I did that deliberately. I spent a
Mhm.
lot of time with him when he was dying. My mom had like a short illness. I was with her, as ostensibly sort of taking care of her, although she was 75 years old. She didn't need anyone
Mm.
to take care of her. And she just didn't wake up. So the way that lands inside your system, the way sudden loss lands inside your
Yeah.
system is more like being hit by a frying pan. Your brain is the way that I describe it often is like I took tiny sips of grief and loss every time I went to go see my dad. Every
Right.
weekend, I was like, up another cup. I was waterboarded when my
Mm.
mom died. And it was like an electrical, misfire. My whole system went down. And the thing about PTSD is that, there's lots of data about like who it impacts and how it impacts them. But essentially, PTSD is this system where you get triggered back into feeling as though you are in the place of threat over and over and over again. So
Right.
it's like short circuiting inside your body. And sometimes it's just like one thing that will trigger it. But for me, I had this ruminative thought, meaning this thought that it was just relentless, that it was my fault that my mother died. And it
Mm.
hit me the second I learned that she died. The sort of words came out of my husband's mouth, and I was like, oh, this is my fault. And
Yeah.
even though I had the like metacognition of being like, Megan, you didn't hit her with your cards, you did
Right.
not cause her death. I also really believed it. So I don't know how to explain that, but that's really what I think PTSD is. Part of you
Yeah.
knows it's not real. And
Yeah.
then part of your body is like, doesn't matter. We're going to run the circuit as if it is. And that actually, that's not a hallmark of grief and loss. That is not a traditional response. That is much more common for people who still have some trauma inside their system.
Mm.
So it's like, oh, there's old mold in here. And so then the wall got wet and now it's like, oh
Right.
my God, this house is uninhabitable.
Yeah.
And it was really surprising and shocking to me. And the thing that I can tell you both about experiencing PTSD and just experiencing profound loss with my mom is it did make me come out the other side feeling like, well, God, I need to write a little note to all my clients to be like, no, 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 now I get it. Before I was just like loving you and trying to,
Yeah.
but I just want you to understand, like, I visited that country you had to live in, and I get what you're talking about. Like,
Yeah.
and with the PTSD, I was like, "Oh," and we don't teach people how to distinguish between grief and loss that is sort of gonna resolve over time, but that time
Mhm.
is gonna look very different than we think because nobody really tells the truth about this, and when it becomes actually a mental health issue. And
Yeah.
so in both of my books, in End of the Hour, I show that to you. And in Can Anyone Tell Me, the last chapters are like, okay, if you've made it this far
Right.
and kind of nothing has helped, you really probably have some energy inside your system that you need support and help with people who are deeply trained in this. And that's what I
Yeah.
say to folks all the time is like, look, I know we all saw The Sopranos. We think that therapy is like you walk in, you kind of, maybe you have a crush on your therapist and you just sort of like maybe tell them the truth or a little bit of the truth, and then they give you their opinions and talk about theory. That's not what trauma therapy is. Trauma therapy is sometimes we're not talking at all. We are just identifying where there's energy inside the body, and we are
Mhm.
using all kinds of tools, whatever the body responds to move that energy through.
Yeah.
And that's more like treatment, right? Like if you had a sore arm, you wouldn't go to a physical therapist and expect the physical therapist to be like, "Let me talk to you about your tendons and,
Yeah.
what we believe helps your tendons." They don't tell you that. They're just like,
Right.
"Okay, move your elbow to the left and now move it to the right and do that
Yeah.
20 times a day."
Well, I love how transparent you are in both of the books with the fact that you still needed help, and I kinda get that way. I'm very open about that as well because
Yes.
I had lost my sister already, I had lost my dad, my mom
Yeah.
had cancer, but when I lost Libby, it was a whole
Yeah.
different it was like I thought I knew
Yes.
how to grieve and what would happen, but it was a totally different experience,
That's
and
right.
I ended up going to an inpatient program at a
Yeah.
hospital because
Yeah.
I couldn't do it on my own, and I
Yeah.
had to recognize that. So I love how transparent you are in the books about the fact that, like, yeah, even though I was a therapist, I knew I needed help because that's
You know
such a big question for people is there we
Yeah.
know that there's no, like, normal, but there's kind of a normal in that if you're doing certain things, you probably should get some extra help.
But it's interesting because it really like it's like, ooh, your bias is showing, right? Every time somebody
Yeah,
asks me the question like, do I need help? Do I need to go see a therapist? What
right.
I say is inherent in your question is the belief that you shouldn't be going to a therapist.
Yeah,
Because you would never be like, do I need to go see a nutritionist? Do I
right.
need to go see Megan, do I need to go see like a hearing doctor? Do I need to? Like,
Yeah,
if we had some kind of fear that going to a hearing doctor meant we were failing at hearing, other than just like, oh shit, my hearing is going.
right.
But that's the point at which there are these diagnoses that I think are not that helpful as a clinician. I what I think is more important is to say to people, if you would like more help,
Mhm.
let's make sure you have it. What's challenging is therapists are not really trained in grief and loss, which is really surprising
Right.
to people considering every conversation we have is about grief and loss, and it actually is not the same. Like if you know how to treat depression and anxiety, grief often has aspects to it that look like depression and anxiety, but the difference being depression and anxiety are sort of systemic and they come in almost like a cloud that sits over a mountain and hangs out there. If I was able to restore, if my mother was if I could make my mother come back from the dead, all my symptoms would go
Mhm.
away. That's how
Right.
we know they're not the same.
Yeah.
And as a clinician, what I feel like is we just have to shift the cultural conversation about this, that there should just be an understanding, and I work with corporations and companies and I have all these statistics like, 51% of people leave their jobs after a profound
Mm.
loss. Like that's what you're dealing with. So
Yeah.
you can have feelings about that. You can be pissed about that. You can not feel like that's your problem. But if someone is walking in and their husband just died, 51%, they're going to leave.
Yeah.
So do you want to do something about that or do you not want to do something about that? Like it's inside your culture.
Yeah.
And there's, our Surgeon General Vivek Murthy who just shifted, he wrote this um study about loneliness and I think in a kind of maybe alarmist way is like, "Oh my god, loneliness, that's so bad for people and isolation is so bad for people. It's like worse than smoking 6 packs of cigarettes." I don't know that that tone is that helpful, right? Because people who are
Right.
isolated don't know how to become unisolated. What I
Yeah.
think would be a much more useful conversation is to say, do you know what the word is that grievers use about themselves? Isolated,
Hmm.
right? There are all these ways in which we talk about stress and how stress is bad for the body. What's the most stressful event in life? Going through a profound loss. And
Yeah.
that profound loss could be your marriage also. It doesn't have to be, or that, or a health issue. It doesn't have to be
Right.
the death of someone. But I think we say, "Oh gosh, you really shouldn't be stressed." And that sounds like you should get a better job because your boss is a jerk,
Yeah.
instead of like, well, what is stressful? And so the
Yeah.
statistics that come out of, and many of them are recent, like we weren't studying the impact of grief and loss in the workplace. But there are some new studies, one of them from empathy.com that talks about the executors of estates. So that's going to be like your senior level management, right? These are the
Right.
most high functioning people in a family
Yeah.
and it takes them 18 months. And 84%, something like 84%, and then there's a different question, it's like 96%, well into the high percentages of those people say that it impacted their mental health and their ability to do their job for
Wow.
18 months. I know. So like, you can have feeling about needing to bring grief education into the places where we are. Like you can be pissed about it, but that is not going to change the fact that it's needed.
Yeah, it's absolutely needed.
Yeah.
So as the executor of my mom's estate, and I'm
Yeah.
still working on things, and it's been
It's a
it's been
full-time
over
job. I
18
mean,
months.
I
Yeah.
I have a client who's in year 5. Like in
Yeah.
year 5 because there were documents that were impossible to get because, her name wasn't on something. It's none of it should be this hard, and that's a problem. How are we going to fix why it's this hard? But we cannot pretend it isn't this hard. And
Yeah.
that somehow you're not doing a good job at it because it is this hard. It is this hard. It is.
It is, and I think part of the problem kinda goes back around to our society and culture and
I
how we
agree.
don't want to have these conversations because I am on my soapbox constantly now, having gone through so many losses that it's like, you need to talk about this shit ahead of time, even if it's
Absolutely.
uncomfortable, and get
Absolutely.
it done just for the people who are left behind because it is so difficult for them
But
if it's
you're
not.
totally right. You're totally right about this, and that's what we do with puberty in schools, right? Like
Mhm.
we tell kids this is what's going to happen to your body
Right.
so they don't freak out. Now, does everything that we teach those kids happen to each body? No, of course not. And that's the same with grief and loss, right? Like if
Yeah.
I tell you you might have brain fog and you're going to have memory loss and you're not going to be able to eat or you're going to eat too much or your sleep. I mean, I can go all the way into the biology of it. I don't generally because people don't need that much information. But to say to a company, "Hey, listen, your accountant just lost his mom. Here's something you need to know. His ability to run numbers is not going to be what it was." Again,
Yeah.
you can have feeling about that. And like maybe that won't be the case. Maybe he'll be totally fine and sharp as a tack, but it's really common for people to not be able to do multi-stepped instructions. That
Yeah.
their brain, because it's so overwhelmed with what it's trying to learn, which is like I have to be in the on the planet without my mom and she's always been here and I don't really know how to do that. I don't have a template for that. The brain is overwhelmed and its capacity to do like one thing is limited. The capacity to do two things, one thing, and then another thing, really limited. And then we have all this data that like there is no third thing. So they used to be
Yeah.
able to do 5 or 6 things in a row and they can't anymore. Again, you can be mad about that. You can wish that is not the case, but that is not going to change. What you have to decide is like, do you not want your accountant at the company? Or do
Right.
you want to provide her with the resources she might need to help calm that brain down? And the best way to do this, for her to feel like that's an okay thing to do, is before there's any kind of profound loss, just bring in
Mhm.
grief educators to talk about what's normal. I mean, it's such
Oh,
an
I love
easy
that.
sell, right? Like,
Yeah.
because the other thing is, it's very hard to learn something when you are going through profound loss. The brain is overwhelmed. It doesn't have the ability to do the curiosity and the sort of updating of new data can really only function And so it's really hard to learn new things, even though a lot of what we're doing in grief and loss is new things. It's
Yeah.
just painful and difficult and the brain resists it. But, on a regular Thursday when we're once a month, we're doing some kind of training to have somebody come in and say, hey, do you want to know what the 5 most typical symptoms of grief and loss are and how long they take to move through your system and what interventions can help and how you should show up for somebody that's having those issues and what you should just assume, you
Yeah.
know, in my book, Can Anyone Tell Me, I spend a lot of time in each chapter being like, look, if you're supporting a griever, here are the things that you can and can't do. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
not instructing it, but a lot of what I'm saying is your thoughts and feelings don't matter.
Right.
And
Well,
that's going to feel like judgment. So be
and it's
careful.
so helpful, and especially, I mean, again, in your book, you do talk about going back to work and what you have to do, and I wanna get back to that in a second, but I'm thinking, like, I'm a perfect example of that. When, Libby died, I had to go back to work as a teacher a
Yeah.
month after she
Oh,
died,
yeah.
and that's a job where you are in front of a,
Yeah.
room full of students all day long putting
That's
on a
right.
show. It took so much energy.
I can't imagine.
I don't even know how I made
Yeah.
it
You look back and you're
through
like,
that.
how'd I
I'm
do
like,
that?
"How did I
Yeah.
do that?" And I'm still, it's year 3 now, but this year, her classmates, it's her class that's in my school, so
Oh,
she would have
Jesus.
been in my
Oh,
school, so I'm teaching all of her friends.
oh
And
man.
just the physical and mental toll from someone who does, I do this grief thing all
I
the
know.
time. This
I
is,
know.
again, like your podcast, this is my side hustle, but just the amount of energy that is,
Yeah.
like, sapped from my body, and I can
Yeah.
feel the brain fog, and it's like all of that stuff just coming back to the surface again because
Totally.
I'm seeing her friends on a
Right.
daily basis and interacting with them, and it's so in my face
That's
that,
right.
yeah, I wish I wish that the workplace culture understood,
Yeah.
what that is like, and that it's not, a couple months or even a year and then it just goes away and you don't
Yeah,
feel it
I mean, you
anymore.
said 3 years, and I'm like, "Oh, that you're still that's so fresh,"
Yeah,
right? I mean,
it
it
it is.
sounds like someone else will be like, "Oh, well, she's 3 years into it. Why is it
Yeah.
still impacting her?" And it's like 3 years is nothing. When you are grieving, 3 years is nothing. It's like, "Oh my god, I'm surprised I can even get out of bed." And, the workplace, the reason I educate in the workplace is like it's a trapped audience, right? Like they're
Yep.
getting training anyway. What we're really trying to do is educate the whole culture. And I do think there's all this like bullshittery.
Yeah.
The most recent one that's making me crazy, and I've heard it like 4 times in the past couple of weeks, is people are like, well, when people are on their deathbed, the only thing that they care about is who they spend time with and
Yeah.
who they love. And you know what? I have worked with people with terminal illnesses. I have been with people on their deathbed, and that none of them said any
Mm.
of that. Multiple, more than one were like, God, I wish I had more to leave the people that are behind. I wish I had
Wow.
another house. I wish and
Yeah.
multiple of them were like, God, I never went to India.
Yeah.
Many of them were just like my own I did not get to finish my life the way that they
Yeah.
were not like, "Oh, I wish I had spent more time with my grandchildren." So the thing that like slays me is that I am in this space. So I do want people to know the truth about what's here.
Yeah.
Like the ethos and a lot of what we get is from television, which is really unfortunate because television I think doesn't have enough respect. They want the lipstick to look good and they want
Right.
the but it never people don't die looking like that. They don't, it doesn't so and what we don't understand is like without other education, that's where we're getting it, right?
Yep.
That's what we get. And the concept for me is like, okay, I had studied all the academic stuff and I still was really surprised by
Mhm.
what it is that it took to become a griever. And the funny thing for me is because I'm in this space, I forget that other people are uncomfortable with it sometimes. And
Yeah.
so like when I was checking myself into treatment, a really well-meaning person on my street was like, "Okay, what are we telling the kids?" And I was like, "Oh, we're telling the kids I'm checking myself into treatment."
Yeah.
And she was like, "Oh, okay, I just wasn't." I mean, she's lovely. She was like, "I wasn't sure." And I was like, "Oh
Yeah.
no, I live in a world where like that actually is not a problem." And I had
Right.
a sibling that was like, "Man, you definitely can't tell anybody that because no one will ever want to know, no one will come see you as a therapist. And I was like, no, that's not how it works. Like,
Exactly.
this is like, oh, serious street cred and
Yeah.
snaps. Now,
They get that you get it. Yeah.
yeah, I did have a client who was like, "Oh, no, you're sicker than me. I can't work with you." And I was like, "Fine, totally fine." But for the most part, what it really meant was it broke through some of that, like, again, I've been in the field a long time, so I'm not a baby therapist, but there is this, again, like this lie that therapists somehow are a blank slate. Like, you come into an
Mhm.
all white room and a therapist who's never had any thoughts or feelings, and you
Yeah.
just get to, as the client, be in the space, and you don't have to care about them and they don't have to care about you. They just have to, like, impart their skills. And, like,
Right.
that is just an unbelievable lie. Like, that
Yeah.
is not it's not a truth that ever existed. And so, again, like, I feel like, no, I think it's probably better for people to know that I had 2 master's degrees and 20 years of experience, and it took me all the way down. I went
Yeah.
all the way, and people were like, "Oh, I couldn't fall apart because I had kids." I'm like, "Oh no, I had 3 kids. And also, I couldn't get off the floor." So,
Yeah.
like, the ways in which I think we comfort ourselves, like, well, it's not that bad, or it couldn't be that bad.
Right.
I mean, what I say to people all the time is, "It is this bad." No, 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 you're
Yeah.
correct. You are telling me you can't live without your kid, and I am telling you I believe you.
Mhm.
And also, because this is the weird way that I think you will. But, like, I
Mhm.
believe that you can't. I believe that you have not invented that part of yourself yet, and you're afraid that you won't be able to, and I'm not actually afraid of that.
Yeah.
Because, like, my being afraid of it doesn't make the job any less yours to do.
Yeah. I love the, when you get the, like, "You're doing so well, all of these things that you're doing and books and whatever after a loss," and it's like, "Yes, but I was also there."
Yeah.
I was
Well,
also
and
there.
I'm really clear, we after my mom died, I took 6 months off, which is a wild privilege to be able to do. I'm not, I took it off as, like, medical leave because I was
Right.
not okay. I wasn't
Yeah.
sleeping, I couldn't eat. I mean, I had treatment, but even when I came out of treatment, it was a long road, and it's still a road. I mean, I still have disrupted sleep and eating,
Yeah.
which may also be menopause, but it's there. But we took a trip across the country. We got in our SUV with our kids and drove across the country during COVID, which, when I look
Mm.
back, I'm like, what in the actual were we doing? Like, we were driving, no vaccines, like,
Yeah.
to Michigan, where people
Alright.
didn't care if there were vaccines or not. But people immediately were like, you are a good parent and you are offering your children. And every time I'd be like, no, 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 this, I can't sit still. This is,
This
I
is for
mean,
me.
even if you were all like, wow, you're really screwing up your kids, I would still be in this van
Yeah.
because the choice of going to sit still on my porch, as I had done when I was early days of sick, was not a choice.
Yeah.
So people are like, you wrote these books, you're so amazing. And I'm like, no, no, you guys,
Yeah.
end of the hour is literally me writing my way through my mental health. It was
Yeah.
me coming back to my mental health. Now, can anyone tell me, was a rage right? Like, I was just like, why are we not telling people the truth? Why have we not taught them about what's going on in their brains and bodies? Like, this is
Yeah.
nonsense. We can have core grief education. Where is it? I'll write it. You know,
Yeah.
that was a different task altogether, but I also wrote a novel, which is still being edited. So people look at that and, like, wow, you're achieving, right? Like, I'm the
Right.
opposite of a loser in grief because I created so much. But
Yeah.
what I'm very clear to tell people is, it's all mental health. It's
Mm.
all, getting up at 3 o'clock in the morning and writing 3 chapters is not a
Yep.
life goal. It
Yeah.
should have been a
Yeah. I
choice,
get the same thing, and I say that with
right?
my book too. It's like
Yeah,
my I think writing my book helped me as much as it's helping anyone else out there. Yeah. It was therapy
that's
for
exactly
me.
right. It's
Yeah.
therapy. Yeah, that's right.
So I want to talk a little bit more about Can Anyone Tell Me? Because I think it
Yes.
is fantastic. So can you it's kind of all about the big unspoken questions that so many people have about grief. Can you just kind of walk the audience through a little bit some of those big questions that you encounter?
Yeah, I mean, so I people are like, "Did it take you a long time? Was it hard to write? Was it?" And I wrote that book in like 8 weeks,
Mm,
and it was not hard for me to write because I have literally written down, I have like an academic, I did a lot of data analysis in an
mm,
old job. I've written down all the questions that people had asked me. So when I was thinking, like, what is it that people struggle with? All I had to do was sort of, like, lump the questions into categories.
Yeah. Yeah.
And God Love Sounds True, who published that book for me, they were like, is there anything else, are there, and I was like, no, these are all, this is it. This is all the
This is
questions that
it.
anyone has ever
Yeah.
asked me. And the book's been out for a while and it's been written for like a year, and it's not like I've come up with others. So what I did was look across my 22 years of working with grievers, my own personal experience with loss, conversations with loved ones, and sort of said, like, what is it that people struggle with? So I
Mhm.
start the book with brain fog because that is the one that scares people, that,
Yeah.
people who haven't had an overwhelming experience before, they really don't understand that the brain has almost this like defensive mechanism to keep you from being overwhelmed, which is like, it just dials you out. It just
Yeah.
fogs you out. And I've spoken to many people, one of whom was my publisher, Zibby Owens, for End of the Hour. Her mother-in-law died of COVID. And she is one of the smartest,
Mm.
sharpest. And she sent me an email that was like, what is going on? I have poor word recall. I can't remember
Yeah.
things. And I was like, oh, can you get on the phone? I'll literally tell you.
Yeah.
And for some people being able to say, like, well, your hippocampus is not getting the information. It's just very comforting. For other
Right.
people, you can just say there's a part of your brain that codes information that isn't getting the right signals right now,
Right.
and it will again. So I can teach it. What I say all the time is like, I can teach it to a kindergartner and I can teach it to a neuroscientist. Either
Exactly.
way,
Yeah.
I can give you as much level of detail as you want. But what I really did was just go through, like, I love the way it's organized because it's like, first it's the brain and then it's the
Yes.
body and then it's relationships. And I just really wanted, as I said to you a minute ago, to tell the truth. Say
Yeah.
the truth out loud. It impacts your brain, and therefore it impacts your body, because your brain and
Yep.
your body are connected with the vagus nerve. Your ability to be inside your brain and your body in a way that seems normal and predictable impacts the relationships around you. It impacts you spiritually. It impacts you, you know, in all kinds of ways. Like, again, one of the things that seems really profoundly painful is that every single person I've ever worked with has some kind of break with someone else
Mhm.
in their loss. So a friend doesn't show up, they're no longer speaking to their mother, their brother said the worst thing
Yeah.
anyone's ever said to them,
Yeah.
because it was meant with love, but it came out with judgment. And
Right.
what I sort of say is, like, that was always going to happen. It was always gonna happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
They knew how to love you and be with you before. And every griever talks about, I miss my before. Like, I wanna go back to that person too, but I can't. And I'm
Right.
trying, almost like an adolescent. You know how teenagers do this thing where, like, one day they come down and they're wearing, like, all black clothes and they painted their nails black. And you're like, "Okay, that goes with the music you were listening." And then the
Yes.
next day, they come down and they're, like, in cowboy boots and a mini skirt, and you're like, "Oh, we're cowboys today." They're trying to land on an identity.
Yeah.
And to some degree, grief does that to you, which is the way that I used to care about stuff is not the same. And
Exactly.
every griever talks about that. And for some of us, I sort of miss how much I didn't care after my mom died. I was like, I don't care if you are offended by me. I don't care if I am going against all the social norms. Like, I don't care. And the problem about not caring is those people still live in the before times. They are
Right.
still in their old life. And so to them, that can seem really hurtful, or, and you may lose that relationship. They may not know how to show up for you. They may have old loss in their own system. What I say in the end of, when it relationships is, you can love them for who they were to you
Mhm.
and be wildly disappointed that they didn't get to come, that there was a bend in the road and
Yeah.
their car didn't make it. Like, they're not with you anymore.
Yeah.
But we don't talk about it. And so grievers are like, "Oh my God, I can't believe this is happening to me and it's
Exactly.
not fair." And
Yeah.
I'm like, "Well, if I taught a class, it would be the third class. Be prepared." And which, by the way, is not your partner. There is this terrifying and erroneous sort of ethos out there that, like, if you lose a child,
Mhm.
you are also going to lose your marriage,
Yeah.
which is, again, it was extrapolated from something somebody said in a study, blah, blah, blah. It turned out to never be true, and it continues
Mhm.
to not be true. And that is the last thing that a couple needs to hear. It's like, oh, well, now you got to be afraid for your marriage. What we should be saying to people is some of your friends will not be here in 6 months.
Yeah.
Some of the people, and it is
Some of
going to
your
surprise
family
you.
members. Yeah.
And also look around for new folks. There are going to be
Mhm.
people that show up in ways, but our brain is sort of primed to notice the painful parts.
Yeah. Yeah. I the organization, I'm gonna get back to the organization because
Yeah.
that's what I love about the book is that you can almost look it up, like, on a particular day. If you're
Yes.
having a particular symptom or something is happening, it's so like, for anyone who hasn't read it, I highly recommend, but you look it up and
Thank
it's just,
you.
can anyone tell me, like, why this is why my
Yeah.
brain feels like this today? Why my,
Yes. Why my
sibling
body's
won't
out of
call me
whack.
back? Why
Yeah.
do I feel that, and it's so yeah, I love how it covers all of those questions again that people don't like to talk about. But you also talk about, you talk about how we are kind of hardwired to focus on the bad, but then there is also the positive aspect of it, and it's hard. I find when I talk to people it's hard to get them to focus on the good things that happen because of deep loss. And I think you actually posted about this on
I did.
Instagram
Yeah.
not too long ago where
I
it's
did.
like, yeah, like, yes, I've had this horrible loss, but it's also been a good thing for these reasons. And I feel like getting to that point is just so healthy. I found that with my own
Yeah.
grief. Like you talked about the marriage and how
Yeah.
I read the same statistic because I lost a
Yeah.
child.
Right. It
But
scared
for
the
me,
shit out of you, I
it
bet.
it was almost a good it was my second marriage and it was terrible. And losing my daughter
Mm.
gave me the ability because I did not give a shit about anything. I was
Yeah.
like, before I was trying to hang on for dear life, and that
Yeah.
just gave me the freedom to be like, I'm not doing this. Like, I no longer
Absolutely.
care what anyone thinks that I'm going to end this second marriage, and I was done, and I felt
Oh,
no
wow.
regret about it. So, I love how you also point out that there are some good things, where you can focus your energy.
I think there's truth in loss,
Yes.
right? And I think that truth is like white hot, like when you're watching someone blow glass and you
Mm,
can't even see it. It's so all the things where it wasn't so much where it was like, oh, I am no longer going to care about my neighbor's Christmas party. It was I cannot care
yeah.
about my neighbor's Christmas party. It's like I
Yeah.
can't pay for this. I don't have the emotional money. So, I'm sorry that they're gonna be upset. I used to be able to, like, well, if they're gonna be upset, let me see if I can, bring myself to care about that, and I can't. I couldn't. I
Yeah.
didn't have any emotional margin, and so that waking up and seeing that part of me, which is like, oh no, this is just you. And what I often said was like I couldn't see past my own hands. Even
Mm.
when I could see people were reacting to what I was doing, it's not like I wanted to cause them pain. But as someone who has maybe caused myself pain at times in my life in order to please others, it was a fascinating study in myself to discover like,
Yeah.
no, no, no. At my core, I do know what I want and need.
Mm.
And I think that can be surprising and scary for people
Yeah.
to just no longer I remember when I started therapy, my therapist would point out every time I made a joke, and it was like she stripped away my capacity to use humor as a defensive mechanism. And and
That
she
sounds
just
terrifying.
right, she'd say things to me like, "I know you wanna make a joke right now," and I'm like, "I can't even do it anymore." Like,
Mm.
I don't have that skill anymore. So, I'm 5 years out from my mother's death, like, I am not as raw and as straightforward, and to some degree, there's betterness in that. But some of what grew out of that white hot truth,
Mhm.
right? So David Kessler talks a lot about, making meaning, and he's not trying to say what was the meaning in your daughter's death. I mean,
Right.
screw that. That's
Yeah.
not what he's saying
Yeah.
is there a way that your life can have been blessed in some way by the
Yeah.
truth of your daughter's death, right?
Yeah.
That trauma is everything that happens after my daughter's death is worse. But that's a terrible legacy. for
Yeah,
her life, right?
exactly.
And I think, I'm always careful on my own podcast, Grief is My Side Hustle. I'm careful to say, I know that there are people right now who are going to write to me or not want to listen anymore because I'm going to say something and it's going to feel like I'm shoving sunshine at you.
Eh,
I'm just telling you, every griever I have ever spoken to at some point says, no, there's stuff that is in my life that I wouldn't have had that is
Yep,
better or not bad on account of the terrible thing. Like that's just the way it goes.
yep,
And I offer that always because, God, we need some hope. I mean, I remember sitting in treatment. I remember sitting in a chair and somebody saying to me, it was so odd in treatment, everybody would be like, "What are you here for?" And I'm like, that is a really abrasive question considering
yeah,
you don't even know my
yeah.
name. But it was just like standard. And then they would say, "I'm glad you're here." So it was like this beautiful like benediction. But
Yeah,
I for a while couldn't even say my mom died. I would just shrug my shoulders. Like I
mhm,
couldn't do it. I couldn't get the words out of my mouth. I couldn't live into a world where she wasn't. I couldn't do it.
yeah,
And now I look at a lot of things, particularly the community that I get to be a part of and add my own thoughts and feelings about the work.
mm.
And it's beautiful. And it would not exist. I mean, look, I never would have written a book about my family while my mother was alive. She would
Yeah.
not have spoken to me. Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
Uh, yeah, I love that, and same for me, say
Yeah.
exactly the
Yeah.
same. If you do not mind, we do have one, viewer question that I
Yes,
wanna throw up there just to make
please.
sure that we get this in. So Rachel says, "I'm sorry, I
Hey,
just tuned in.
Rachel.
I just wanted to share one of the things I'm going through right now from the loss of my son. He died so young and didn't get to live his life to the fullest." So, yeah, Rachel, I deal with the same
Right.
thing.
Right.
So, I I'm not sure exactly what the if there's a question there or if it's just something that you're struggling with
Can I
that
say
he
something
didn't live
about
his
it?
life.
I mean, you are
Sure.
much more poised to talk about child loss, but what I will say, and I think it's important, is that every kind of loss, like we could do little breakout groups. You have
Yeah.
people who lost their dads and people who lost their dogs and people who lost their marriage. And I think people do that a lot and we think it's going to be good. We think that's going to be good for people. It isn't always. It
Yeah.
isn't always great to be in a room full of people whose kids also died because that one's kid died in a way more violent way than mine. And
Yeah.
now I feel like, oh, well, theirs is worse. The thing about losing a child is you lose every dream, all the castles, all that
Yeah.
joy that you anticipate having. You lose their whole future, which is
Yeah.
distinctly different than when my dad died at 80, right?
Yeah.
There's no regret. There's no pain around what he did or didn't get to do in my mind because he got to choose it. He lived to 80.
Yep.
Nobody looks at that and says, "Man, that guy was shortchanged." It's not a tragedy. But losing a child is always a tragedy. It
Yeah.
never ever will feel right in nature. It's not. I think there are some folks who would say like, "Well, nobody is guaranteed any years on the planet and maybe a teenager, that's all they get." I'm not sure that's helpful. I think
Mm-mm.
what is helpful is to say the part that you lost is the part that is distinctly yours. And so it's very lonely in that part because you can't say remember when he did this because part of what you lost was just the hope that he was going to graduate from college
Yeah.
or the hope that he was going to get married. And you hoped that in your own mind. And so there's nobody in there with you. There's nobody to say, let's go have a support group about what you hoped and dreamed the moment you held your child after,
Yeah.
you met them for the first time. And I do think that is an exquisite, specific kind of pain, the same way that I think when you lose someone to homicide or suicide, that there is a kind of violence that is very specific,
Yep.
that creates these very specific kind of regrets that are true to that kind of death. So I just want to say that about child loss, that it is.
Yeah. Rachel, I know, you watch a lot of my videos and comment on a lot of my videos, so I know a little bit about what Rachel's going through. But yeah, it is one of the hardest things I think with child loss is thinking about the future that they don't have.
Yeah.
There are so many moments. I actually just had one yesterday. I was watching my niece play basketball and the girls are now right around the age
Yeah.
where my daughter died. So I had that kind of double-edged sort of like, they kind of, some of them kind of look like her, at the age that she died. But then I kept thinking and picturing Libby sitting on the sidelines with me cheering for her cousin. And I'm like, man, she would have loved to be here. She would have been
Yeah.
like yelling for her cousin. And that would have been so much fun. So Rachel, I would say have those pictures. Like and
Yeah.
I think it helps me if I say them out loud. So I said that to my brother. Like, man, Libby would have loved this. She would have loved watching her cousin playing basketball.
Mm,
She'd be screaming and cheering or whatever. Um, so I feel like kind of voicing those, I wonder what
yeah.
Libby would be doing right now. So with your son, I wonder how he would have reacted to this, or what he would have thought of this movie, or what he would have thought of this vacation that we're taking or whatever. Like, it seems like it's painful, but don't hold it in, like, voice that. And I, even with Libby, kind of picture how she would look or how she'd be acting in that situation. And I feel like the more you do that, it's always going to have the pain, but it almost becomes kind of like a pleasurable thing to do as well. It's not, I guess the pain lessens a little bit. The sting isn't quite as bad the more you do that, the more you get used to just kind of imagining how they would be, rather than not trying to think about it. So my advice is always just, make it vocal. Don't try to push it down. Just kind of honor those feelings that you're
It's so
having.
good.
And yeah.
Well, you're
Yeah.
less alone then too. Like, even if people can't understand you, they know, like if I said to you like, "Oh, I'm having a panic attack right now," but I don't even tell you what it's about.
Right.
At least you know I'm not okay.
Yeah.
And then I might come and say, "Oh, there was a spider and I'm really afraid of spiders." Oh, okay. I didn't know that about Megan. But I need to let you know that I'm not okay.
Right.
And then I do think there's something about like just carving space to not be okay. And I have said
Yeah.
it, again, it's not the same, but I have had people who are like, "Oh yeah, no, I'm going home for my dad's 86th birthday and then I'm going to see my mom." And I'll just be like, "Whoa, you have
Yeah.
parents." Like, you have
Same.
parents. And for what, it doesn't always happen, but every once in a while I'm like, "God, it's so painful." And what will happen is they're still talking and I'm in my pain. I'm not paying any
Yeah.
attention. And so I have to say like, ho, hang on just a second. Like, I'm doing that thing I sometimes do where like I'm doing the emotional math of like, why did you get 6 more years with your dad than I did? Just give
Yeah.
me a second. I'm okay. And they're like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have said that." Nope, that's not, you should have said it. You're going home.
Yeah.
You don't have to protect me from the pain of the fact that I don't have my parents. That's not your job. But I can't pretend that all didn't just, I can't pretend that you
Right.
didn't just accidentally kick me in the shin, and
Yes.
I need a minute to rub it, and then I'll listen, and then I'll
And I feel
listen.
like we're so scared to do that, and that, I feel like, would help so much if everyone
But
would do that.
I think it's because we pathologize grief and we make
Yeah.
it seem like, well, you're still sad after your
Yeah.
daughter died 3 years. Like, of course I'm still
Of
sad.
course.
I'm going to be sad my whole life.
I
And that's
know.
okay. It doesn't mean I'm
Yeah.
losing. I'm not a loser because I'm sad. We
Exactly.
will, the things that we love and then we live without always have a bitter sweetness to us. And some days that's harder than others. Some days there's a catch
Yeah.
in my throat and I'm going to cry, and I don't know why, and it doesn't matter why. But
Right.
I think we look at that and we're like, "Oh, well, she's really not doing well." Instead of, "Oh yeah, that's totally
It's
normal." And there are
totally
other
normal.
cultures that do a better job. There are.
Yes.
We're bad at it. We are bad at it.
Exactly. Completely agree.
Yeah.
Like, we are out of time already. That flew
How did
by
that
so
happen?
fast. I feel like I got through like 3 of the questions that I had for you, but oh my goodness. Thank you so much. Are there
Ugh.
any things, I feel like you're like hosting things all over the place and doing talks and classes, and you've got their books. So is there anything that you would like to let their viewers know about?
Yeah, I mean, right now, my big passion is allowing people to be seen and feel like their experience is normal by teaching what I
Mhm.
believe to be the truth. So I am teaching tonight at 7 o'clock Eastern time, a class, which is basically like I am walking people through the exercises in Can Anyone Tell Me?
That's
So the book
amazing.
has, descriptions and chapters, and then there's like something to try. And so we go through the chapters. People can ask me questions. They can talk about their personal experience. It's a pretty big group. I think there's 35 of us, but people are welcome, and there's still scholarships. So if you want to come, just DM me, come find me on Instagram.
Okay.
But I am, if, yeah, I mean, come find, I put it up on Instagram. So come follow me on Instagram. Like I'm going to be teaching at Omega with Barry Liner Grant from the Memory Circle in May. And then I'm going to be up in Boston in March. I'm going to be at the Psychotherapy Networker yeah, I mean, I got a lot of stuff
You
that
are
are,
everywhere. I know.
it's really lovely. It's really lovely because what it means is people are finding the way in which I am, I'm not the first person to talk about these things in this way, but again, I think there are different ways that we can hear it from different people. And it's
Yeah.
just lovely to have folks who want to sit with me and talk about grief and loss. And so yeah, come to my Instagram. That's probably the easiest place
All
to
right.
find me. Or you can come to the website and actually come to the website and sign up for the newsletter. You won't miss anything. We
Okay.
send out, that comes out on Fridays, and it's got like, Megan's going to be here. She's going to be on this podcast. She's doing this thing. And I love all the support.
Great. I will link all of that in the show notes and the description on YouTube, so everybody will just be able to click on it there to find you. Are you
Thank
doing another
you.
Grief-tastic book fair? That's my
Well, now
question.
listen. There's a rumor. We have not formally announced, but
All
we
right.
may. I think we would never not show up for LA after everything that has happened in LA.
Yeah.
So if you were looking to hold maybe the 20th and the 21st of November
All
and
right.
thinking about coming out to Endwell in LA, we might be announcing soon that the Grief
All
Tastic Book
right.
Fair is coming back.
Sounds good. All right. Well, Megan, thank you so much for
It is
talking with us
so
today.
nice to finally get to meet you like this.
Yes,
Thank you so much for
virtually. I
having
know.
me on.
Yes.
I know, I
Yes.
know.
Great.
So great.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for watching. Again, my book is Grief Sucks, but Your Life Doesn't Have to. Megan has two. They are the end of the
End of the
hour,
hour.
right?
Yep. And can anyone tell me?
And Can Anyone Tell Me? So they are available, and I will link to her website, and you can find her all over the place with the many things that she is doing. So until next time, I will see you guys later. Sending love and hugs as always, and have a great rest of your day.